On va prendre place, merci. Bon, parfait. Alors, tout se déroule selon le plan, tout va bien. Alors, écoutez, on en est rendu à notre première tribune. En fait, les opérations multidomaines, comme dans certaines régions du Québec, on a l'habitude de dire qu'est-ce que ça mange en hiver. Alors, la première tribune, c'est une tribune qui va parler des opérations multidomaines, mais avec une perspective plus académique. Donc, on met la table ce matin dans cette tribune-là avec une perspective académique. Et pour diriger cette tribune, on a Nicolas Rodriguez, qui est un doctorant à l'Université Laval en ce moment. Nicolas Rodriguez est aussi l'adjudant Nicolas Rodriguez, qui est en ce moment sergent-major d'une compagnie au centre d'instruction de la 2e division. Alors donc, c'est un privilège, Nicolas, de t'avoir avec nous, puis que tu es là. Écoutez, vraiment, il n'a pas été volontarisé pour prendre ce job-là. Là. C'est venu de lui, une belle initiative. Alors, Nicolas, merci, et puis je te laisse avec la tribune qui devrait terminer vers 10h15. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Général. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? Yes. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to everybody online. La manière qu'on va fonctionner pour la tribune, c'est qu'on va faire les 3 présentations et ensuite il va y avoir la période d'échange, la période de questions par la suite. Écoutez, nous vivons dans un monde dangereux. Nous vivons aujourd'hui dans un monde dans lequel les défis sont de plus en plus complexes. Les spécialisations ne suffisent souvent plus à elles-mêmes à résoudre les problématiques. Académiquement, les disciplines sont de plus en plus embrouillées. Sciences et technologies, droit, économie, politique, stratégie. Ce ne sont plus des mondes séparés, mais des leviers qui doivent travailler en silo pour être efficaces. Du côté de la défense, nous devons pouvoir opérer dans l'ensemble de l'environnement opérationnel. Et c'est là que les concepts du multidomaine, du pandomaine embarquent. C'est un concept qui est complexe, mais qui arrive somme toute avec une idée qui est assez simple. C'est l'idée que les grands défis d'aujourd'hui ne peuvent pas être résolus avec une seule approche. Et la force du concept est là. C'est dans la capacité à penser en réseau, à croiser des savoirs et à innover là où d'autres verraient des limites. Aujourd'hui, nous avons réuni des esprits qui incarnent cette vision et notre premier panéliste pourra beaucoup mieux vous expliquer les concepts que moi-même. Monsieur Nils French a travaillé sur le développement du concept du pandomaine en tant qu'analyste de la défense du contrat. Il est également un officier ingénieur avec proche des 30 ans d'expérience dans les forces armées canadiennes. Il a maintenant les grades de major. Il a déployé en Afghanistan et il a occupé divers postes de commandement. Il a 3 maîtrises, vous avez bien entendu, 3 maîtrises. Et il a suivi des études avancées en défense et en guerre irrégulière. Il est actuellement réserviste et il continue à développer des rôles stratégiques au sein des forces armées canadiennes. Bonjour, Monsieur Nils French, la parole est à vous.
Bonjour, l'audio, c'est bon? Ça marche? OK.
Ça marche.
Bon matin. Premièrement, j'aimerais remercier l'Université Laval non seulement pour m'avoir accueilli aujourd'hui, mais aussi pour quelque chose de plus historique. C'est un peu d'un retour aux sources. J'ai servi au 5e RGC à Valcartier de 2004 à 2006, il y a 20 ans. À l'époque, je faisais ma première maîtrise à temps partiel, à distance, et pour ça, j'avais besoin de livres. J'obtenais beaucoup de ces livres grâce à la bibliothèque de l'Université Laval. Alors, merci, Université Laval. Euh, Quand j'entends de multidomaine, je pense à pandomaine. Ce n'est pas la même chose, mais il y a un lien entre les deux. Et quand je pense à pandomaine, je pense au PFEC, le concept d'emploi de la force pandomaine. Pour moi, c'est là que la discussion sur la pandomaine commence pour les forces armées canadiennes d'aujourd'hui. And as I was heavily involved with the PFEC from start to finish, I'm going to be talking about what it is, where it came from, and then lastly, what I think some of its implications are for naval power. And I think that what is tricky here is that the PFEC is about much, much more than just operations in multiple domains. And the very meaning of pandomain, as it's defined in the PFEC, is also about more than just multiple domains. So pandomain is defined in the PFEC as meaning across the operating environment as a unified whole. An operating environment is defined as the surroundings in which military operations take place, whatever they may be, all of it, everything. Coherence is another word that is added in a note to the definition of pandomain. So academically, it's about everything and everything together as a whole. That's what pandomain means, and that's really what the PFEC is about. That which is the most important for the Canadian Armed Forces right now. It's the thinking that is needed to take the CAF forward. Donc, voilà un intro très rapide de qu'est-ce que c'est. Je vais donner plus de détails un peu plus tard dans la discussion, mais avant ça, je vais vous parler d'où ça vient. Les origines du PFEC remontent à l'automne de 2018. Et pour faire simple, le commandement des opérations interarmées du Canada, COIC, a commencé à poser la question, comment devons-nous battre? How should we fight? Ils ont posé 7 questions à 5 penseurs des forces armées canadiennes, incluant moi-même, mais il y en avait un de plus, le commandant du COIC lui-même, le lieutenant-général Mike Rouleau. À ce moment-là, il dirigeait les opérations des FAC depuis 5 ans, une partie comme commandant des forces d'opération spatiales et une partie comme commandant du COIC. Et en février 2019, tous les penseurs ont rédigé son propre document How We Fight. Et je vais parler du document du général Rouleau en particulier. Il voyait que les capacités interarmées ne pouvaient plus être secondaires par rapport aux capacités des services. Il voyait nos interactions avec nos adversaires tous les jours, partout dans le monde. Il sentait que la force armée canadienne était à un point tournant. Il écrivait qu'une approche, comme d'habitude, mettrait en danger notre capacité à suivre le rythme des adversaires et à combattre aux côtés de nos alliés. Il voyait qu'il fallait être prêt en même temps pour des opérations de combat majeurs et pour la compétition sur le niveau du conflit. Le PFEC est devenu un des moyens de répondre à cette situation. La première ébauche est sortie en octobre 2019, 9 mois plus tard, mais il y a eu des retards. La COVID, des changements au chef d'état-major et d'autres postes clés, une élection, des mutations. Et pendant les prochains 3-4 ans, il y a eu 5 revues différentes et plus de 500 commentaires à travers le MDN et les FAC. On a même fait une relecture complète après l'invasion de l'Ukraine en 2022 et au final, on a changé un seul mot. Donc, le PFEC a tenu et ça tient encore aujourd'hui. Ce qui est important, c'est que les idées du document a commencé à être utilisées en 2009, en version embauche. Puis la version officielle du PFAC a été publiée en octobre 2023, signée par le chef d'état-major à l'époque, le général Eyre. Et je veux ajouter, surtout pour cette audience, que si le PFAC a été approuvé, c'est en grande partie grâce au colonel David Brassard, commandant de la 5e brigade en ce moment, un directeur à Coec à le temps. Il a poussé sans relâche pour que ça soit validé. So back to what it is in more detail. The PFAC starts with a clear description of our strategic and operational context. It describes hostile adversaries, specifically naming China and Russia, and really, I think, for the first time, or at least in such a clear way. It talks about autocratic leaders undermining the rules-based international order and Canadian interests, and using all their instruments of national power to do so, and identifies a clear need to respond to this. And part of that strategic and operational context is a set of 5 imperatives. And within those imperatives, it talks about the need to strengthen deterrence. And deterrence was not something we were talking a lot about at the time, or at least the discussion was just really starting to take hold. Doing that while countering sub-threshold actions of state adversaries. There was a lot on prioritization, particularly the prioritization of threat-based approaches, threats being the primary driver of Canadian Armed Forces planning and investing, and the need to solve specific operational problems. The PFAC asserts the need to work across domains, leverage all instruments of national power, and that we would need to be tightly connected with our allies. And then lastly, it establishes clearly that Canada faces credible threats right here at home in Canada. Multiple attack vectors that threaten our governance, national unity, critical infrastructure, and it asserts the need to strengthen North American defenses. And then it presents 14 elements, and you can see these as attributes that describe the kind of CAF that we needed to become. Some of the elements develop the imperatives that I just discussed in more depth, and I won't go over those again. And other elements call on the Canadian Armed Forces to address the full array of threats and challenges, whether it's conventional or irregular, military or non-military, to focus very clearly on strategic objectives. There are some specific discussions on spatial and temporal factors. There are calls for us to adopt artificial intelligence and evolve how we conduct intelligence planning in C2. And there are discussions on capability, interoperability, and on culture and resilience. And lastly, it presents a campaigning approach to deliberately focus the CAF's efforts against the most acute operational problems. So that's the PFAC. Now, for my last portion today, I'm going to try and apply that broad kind of PFAC context to naval power or maybe maritime power, which I'll leave for further discussion today. Now, having spent some time looking at this, I'll offer what I'll call 5 implications or 5 tips. And the first thing I would say is that it has to be about the ends. Any discussion on naval or maritime power has to be about naval power as a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. It has to be part of the solution to a specific operational problem. And I would say that our maritime domain problems are probably the highest priority operational problems that we have. So defining that problem has to come first, has to be the start point. And specifically, I think that the goal here when it comes to naval power is to deny our adversaries the ability to operate in our approaches. And I think it's also important to make clear that this is defensive primarily. It's not offensive. It's here, not on the other side of the world. And I think that shapes the kind of naval power that you need. And I'll tell you from experience that things start to become much, much, much more clear once you've defined the operational problem. So make it about those ends. The second thing is that it has to be about all of it. To have naval power, you have to do all of it. So everything that is discussed in the PFAC, you can't just integrate perfectly across the domains and then ignore everything else. You can't ignore the other instruments of national power or modernizing equipment or clear prioritization or resilience. You need all of those elements. Pan-domain integration is just one of the elements, and there's a lot more than that that needs to be brought together. The third that I would have is, and maybe the biggest one for this discussion, is that it's not just about the Navy. The PFEC says we can no longer see things as single domain problems with single domain solutions, and that services will increasingly be required to deliver effects into other domains and to focus on what they can contribute as part of a pan-domain force. The maritime domain is not just the Navy. I mean, the Air Force for years has got this, but I think that the Army in particular needs to see itself more as having a role to play in the maritime domain. And that really makes a lot of sense when you start looking at the Arctic archipelago, when you look at the kinds of ranges that we're now seeing on missile systems, when you look at the direction that the US Marine Corps is moving in, setting themselves up to be able to have effects from land far into the maritime domain. The land domain is crucial when we consider the need for persistence and all-weather operations and magazine depth and the importance of hiding in the clutter of a land environment. So I'll leave that one there and move to the fourth point. It's not just about ships. So this is the year 2025. This is about autonomous systems, surface, subsurface, and in the air. It's about sensors on the seabed and on shore. It's about long-range missiles. It's about networks. It's about artificial intelligence. Look at Ukraine against Russian forces in the Black Sea. It's all of those things, and they decimated the Black Sea fleet. And the fifth and the last tip or implication I would offer is that it's not ships first and we'll figure out the rest later. The concept that integrates all of these things together is needed first, and it needs to be designed as an overall system to solve specific operational problems from the outset. The PFEC says that we need to see connections and relationships between domains, between capabilities and forces as equally or even more important than the individual components themselves. We need a network of effects, a mesh of capability, and we need to really see it in this way. The PFEC also asks, how do we integrate effects across domains? Yes, this is certainly technical, but it's also conceptual, and we really need to do the thinking on this. The US Navy is taking a disaggregated and distributed approach, working across vast ranges, which is the spatial element of the PFEC, with weapons and effects that move extremely fast, which is the temporal element of the PFEC, and linking from space to air to surface to land to undersea. We need to think through what that looks like for us. So it calls for the design of warfare, and it calls for that now and not later. So that's the five that I would offer, and overall, those are my thoughts on what pan-domain, where the PFEC came from, how the definition of pan-domain fits into it, what the PFEC is, where it came from, and how that might apply to naval power. Thank you.
Brillant. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Nils French. Thank you so much, Nils. Please stay online. Tous ceux qui ont des questions et qui ont une mémoire des poissons comme moi, s'il vous plaît, écrivez vos questions dans une feuille, puis venez les poser à la fin. Notre deuxième panéliste va nous offrir une toute autre approche. Professeur Olivier Choinière est professeur et directeur des programmes d'études supérieures en gestion des projets à l'Université du Québec à Rimouski. Il est titulaire d'un doctorat en gestion publique de l'Université d'Ottawa. Il est expert en gouvernance, gestion des projets et finances publiques. Ses recherches portent sur la gouvernance des projets d'infrastructures militaires et publiques, les approches émergentes en gestion des projets et l'avenir du travail dans les secteurs publics. Il est aussi chercheur affilié au Center on Governance de l'Université d'Ottawa et à l'Institut de la Conférence des associations de la Défense, qui est aussi appelée les CDA Institute. Professeur Choinière, la parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup aux organisatrices, aux organisateurs, Anessa, Nicolas, M. Giguère. Donc, merci beaucoup de m'accueillir. Donc, comme Nicolas disait, je viens du monde académique et du monde du management. Donc, je veux vous présenter une perspective de la gestion de projet, de son importance, notamment pour la stratégie nationale de construction navale. Donc, les deux termes à retenir aujourd'hui, c'est performance et capacité. Puisque plus on est performant dans nos projets, des projets de plusieurs dizaines, voire centaines de milliards, plus on obtient de la capacité en termes de multidomaine. J'avais une présentation. Désolé. Ah, super. Et ça fonctionne. Et d'ailleurs, pour vous présenter un peu la stratégie, les risques, les défis entourant le plus grand projet d'acquisition militaire en termes d'argent depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, en valeur courante. On a célébré le 7 mars dernier le 15e anniversaire de la stratégie, avec l'annonce de 3 contrats totalisant environ 14 milliards de dollars pour 3 chantiers navals au Canada. Donc, je trouvais aussi que c'était très intéressant de venir vous en parler aujourd'hui. Et en plus, on apprenait ce matin le rapprochement là, entre l'Union européenne et le Canada sur leur méga plan pour renouveler leur défense d'un montant d'environ 800 milliards de dollars. Donc, je trouvais que c'était un sujet extrêmement d'actualité à vous présenter. Donc, les 3 grands objectifs de la stratégie, j'imagine que la majorité d'entre vous les connaissent déjà, mais je vais insister sur leur équilibre fragile, puisque en aucun cas, d'un point de vue officiel de la part du gouvernement, on a priorisé un de ces objectifs. Donc, on a renouvelé les flottes de navires de combat et non destinés au combat, autant pour la marine, donc la marine royale canadienne, pour la garde côtière canadienne également. Développer l'industrie maritime de manière durable. On veut éviter ce qu'on a connu dans les dernières décennies où ce que les chantiers maritimes obtenaient de grands contrats et puis après, plus rien pendant des décennies. Donc, non seulement ce n'est pas bon pour maintenir l'industrie, la capacité au Canada, mais en termes d'expertise et de connaissances, ce sont de grandes pertes lorsqu'on a des cycles bas en termes de contrats. Et le dernier, c'est assurer les retombées pour les entreprises canadiennes selon la politique de retombées industrielles et technologiques. Et ça date de 1965, en passant, où il y a eu la première politique Buy Canadian Ships. Donc, ça fait longtemps qu'on veut construire justement notre capacité navale ici même au Canada. Je vais y revenir justement sur cette équipe fragile entre les 3 objectifs. Il y a 3 grands portefeuilles qui sont appelés par le gouvernement 3 piliers. Donc, le principal, celui qu'on entend, celui qui défraie les manchettes régulièrement, c'est les grands navires, donc déplacement de plus de 1000 tonnes, qu'on évalue aujourd'hui à 90 milliards. D'ailleurs, ces chiffres sont difficiles à estimer, donc il faut souvent qu'on aille dans les, dans les press releases, dans les annonces officielles de presse pour pouvoir arriver à ces calculs. Les petits navires, pour 292 millions, donc je ne dis pas que c'est moins important en termes stratégiques, mais c'est sûr que c'est moins important en termes monétaires. Et finalement, tout l'entretien, la maintenance sur les prochaines décennies d'une valeur qu'on estime aujourd'hui à 13 milliards de dollars. Donc, si on fait un calcul rapide, on dépasse le 100 milliards de dollars et ce chiffre continue évidemment à augmenter. Ce qui est intéressant d'un point de vue de gouvernance et de gestion de projet, c'est qu'on est en présence d'un rare, si vous voulez, méga projet où j'ai plusieurs maîtres d'ouvrage, donc celles et ceux qui donnent l'ouvrage, les spécifications, et plusieurs maîtres d'œuvre qui réalisent les travaux. Ce sont des milliers de personnes qui travaillent sur ces différents projets. Encore une fois, en termes de gestion de projet, c'est des choses qu'on voit très rarement. Ce n'est pas comme construire un tramway à Québec ou un 3e lien. Là. La complexité, elle est décuplée. Donc, on a plusieurs ministères et organismes fédéraux. On a, bien sûr, ici la Défense nationale, avec son côté du ministère, donc ADM-MAT, pour celles et ceux qui connaissent, la Marine royale canadienne, même structure, grosso modo, au niveau de Pêche et Océan Canada, avec la Garde côtière canadienne. On a l'entité contractuelle avec PSPC, donc Service public Canada, ISDE, dont je suis un ancien cadre. En passant, j'ai oublié de déclarer le fait que j'étais un ancien cadre supérieur à ISDE avant d'être professeur d'université, qui s'occupe de la retombée industrielle et technologique. Le secrétaire du Conseil du Trésor qui s'assure que l'argent est dépensé de façon efficace et efficiente, ainsi de suite, ainsi de suite. On a 3 chantiers canadiens qui sont en compétition. Donc, on les a inclus au sein de la stratégie, mais il ne faut pas oublier que ces chantiers sont en compétition. Et maintenant, on a un 4e chantier qui a été ajouté la semaine dernière officiellement, donc Helsinki, qui va obtenir 30 des heures travaillées sur le brise-glace polaire qui va être construit majoritairement à 3 km de mon université, là, au chantier Davy. Et on a une pluralité de comités de gouvernance et de gestion. Mon équipe et moi, dont Maude Brunet de HEC Montréal, on a tenté vainement, je vous dirais, de faire la cartographie de tous les comités interorganisationnels dans les ministères, mais aussi au sein des chantiers. Donc, par nos entretiens, par la demande d'accès à l'information, on a essayé de recréer ces comités. Je ne crois pas qu'on est capable d'avoir une cartographie. C'est des puzzles qui nous manquent plusieurs pièces. Là, vous savez, les puzzles que vous sortez après quelques années. Donc, il nous manque quelques pièces, mais juste pour vous dire un peu l'ensemble des structures de gouvernance qu'on a. Donc, quand on parle de gouvernance d'un portefeuille, exemple, les grands chantiers, on a des comités interministériels au niveau des sous-ministres adjoints, des directeurs généraux. On a 2 secrétariats qui ont fusionné récemment. On a l'ensemble des comités aussi que vous avez à DND, que ce soit du côté de ADM Math, mais aussi la marine. Sans oublier aussi la garde côtière canadienne, avec qui vous allez partager notamment le EOPS. Donc, M. Baudouin a parlé récemment, là, donc le navire de patrouille extra-côtier et de l'Arctique. Et vous avez aussi une gouvernance et une gestion de projet au sein de chacun des projets. Et chaque navire, exemple, dans le portefeuille des grands navires, à l'exception d'un seul, va coûter, en développement et en maintenance, plus d'1 milliard de dollars. Donc, chaque navire se qualifie comme un méga projet. Donc, c'est beaucoup de 3e lien et beaucoup de tramways à Québec. Donc, les plus récents développements, pour celles et ceux qui n'étaient peut-être pas au courant, j'ai pris les noms officiels selon le gouvernement des navires. Je sais qu'il y en a qui changent, comme les navires de combat. Maintenant, on les appelle les destroyers de fleuves et rivières. Mais grosso modo, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que le 7 mars 2025, on a signé 3 grands contrats. Donc, un brise-glace polaire pour la Davy, Helsinki, un brise-glace polaire pour Seaspan à Vancouver et les 3 premiers destroyers au niveau de Irving, puisqu'on a presque terminé les EOPS du côté de la marine et on est en construction maintenant des EOPS du côté de la garde côtière. Or, Irving ne peut pas fabriquer les 2 types de navires de façon simultanément. Ça ne se fait pas comme ça. Les navires de soutien interarmé, c'est probablement un des projets qui a connu le plus grand retard. Donc, c'est un projet qui a démarré, pour celles et ceux qui se souviennent, en 2004. Et le premier navire, le protecteur, là, est en phase d'essai et le 2e navire devrait sortir en 2027, ce qui a fait en sorte que la Davy est rentrée en 2019 dans la stratégie pour pallier, bon, vous allez me dire qu'il y a des raisons politiques, je ne vous le cacherai pas, mais entre autres pour pallier au retard encouru au chantier de Seaspan. J'y vais. Il me reste combien de temps? 5 minutes? 5 minutes, d'accord. Donc, l'importance d'une saine gestion de projet et la relation entre défense nationale et gestion de projet, elle est très proche. Si vous voulez, l'approche plus scientifique en gestion de projet a été développée notamment par la défense nationale, que ce soit canadienne, américaine, en Europe. Donc, ne serait-ce que le chemin critique, le PERT, ça vient de la défense nationale. Donc, ce sont des précurseurs pour justement faire une saine gestion de projet. Il y a 6 grands aspects qu'il faut regarder. Souvent, on se concentre sur les 3 premiers. Projet, coût et échéancier. C'est ce qu'on voit souvent dans les médias. Mais il ne faut pas oublier les risques, comme on a pu voir avec le GSS à Seaspan. La qualité, évidemment, les bénéfices qu'on tire escomptés. Donc, M. Nils qui parlait, ce n'est pas juste des navires, mais c'est tout ce qu'on veut faire avec les navires. Donc, on parle de bénéfices. Malheureusement, et le graphique le montre, l'être humain en général, dans tous les pays, dans tous les domaines, est très mauvais avec la méga-projet. Donc, si on regarde seulement la triple contrainte, donc portée, coût, échéancier, l'étude de Fluberg de 2023 qui a analysé 16 000 méga-projets, donc de plus d'1 milliard de dollars, il y a seulement 0,5, donc 800 projets sur 16 000 qui respectent la triple contrainte. Donc, encore une fois, ce n'est pas seulement dans le domaine militaire, c'est dans tous les pays, tous les domaines. Et ce qui a amené Fluberg à dire, c'est quoi la loi pour les mégaprojets? Over budget, over time, under benefit. Mais les mégaprojets sont difficiles à réaliser et on connaît la clé. La clé, c'est 3 mots: innover, modularité et reproductibilité. Donc, quand on regarde du EOPS ou les futurs destroyers, lorsqu'on en construit 6, 8, 15, on a cet effet de modularité ou de reproductibilité. Par contre, quand on parle des brise-glaces polaires et qu'on a séparé les 2 brise-glaces polaires sur 2 chantiers, on n'a plus de modularité et on n'a plus de reproductibilité. Donc, je ne fais pas un jugement sur les contrats, je vais juste vous dire qu'en termes de gestion de projet, on élimine les économies d'échelle. J'y vais très rapidement. Les problématiques de leadership partagé ici, c'est sans jugement. Okay? Je ne juge pas des compétences, des qualités. C'est juste pour vous dire, c'est des problématiques qu'on retrouve au sein de la stratégie nationale et qu'on voit aussi dans d'autres mégaprojets. Donc, les objectifs sont parfois contradictoires. Est-ce que je veux des navires en temps opportun ou je veux créer des emplois et soutenir l'industrie maritime? On a eu une première réponse officieuse il y a 2 semaines lorsqu'on a décidé d'intégrer un chantier non canadien, donc Helsinki, où ce qu'on semble maintenant valoriser le premier objectif, qui est d'obtenir des navires en temps opportun. Donc, on va accélérer les choses et d'ailleurs, on devrait, au conditionnel, avoir notre premier brise-glace polaire en 2030. C'est un environnement volatile, incertain, complexe et ambigu, donc où l'information et les résultats sont parfois pas clairs. On manque d'informations, des fois on a trop d'informations. Et comme vous le savez, là, vous lisez les médias, vous êtes pour la majorité en défense nationale. L'environnement stratégique change littéralement à chaque semaine, voire à chaque jour, notamment ce rapprochement avec l'Europe, qui incidemment pourrait créer beaucoup de contrats au Canada. Donc, des multiples structures de gouvernance et de gestion sans leadership clair ou de leadership permanent. Et je veux faire la différence avec une simple présidence d'un comité. Ce n'est pas parce qu'exemple, travaux publics préside un comité qui a nécessairement le leadership au niveau de ces grands projets-là. Et on voit que dans certains comités, le chair, donc la présidence, est tournante. Donc, on change de présidence, ce qui rend la gouvernance interorganisationnelle plus ou moins claire. Évidemment, la hiérarchie décisionnelle interorganisationnelle est non établie. Encore une fois, les partenaires sont sur un pied d'égalité, du moins officiellement. La gestion du risque, c'est probablement aussi ce qu'avait le Bureau du vérificateur général du Canada, une des plus grandes lacunes présentement qu'on reconnaît à la stratégie. Donc, souvent, on identifie des enjeux. Donc, c'est des risques qui se sont déjà matérialisés, plutôt qu'identifier des risques qui sont encore du domaine de l'incertitude. Et finalement, les compétences. C'est un peu des problèmes, comme je vous dis, lorsqu'on a des cycles de haut en bas, mais on perd cette compétence autant au niveau des différents ministères que des différents chantiers. Il y en a, je ne sais pas si vous saviez, le CISPAD au début avait énormément de misère à recruter des ingénieurs pour pouvoir commencer la construction. Il n'y avait pas de problème au niveau des cols bleus, mais au niveau des cols blancs, CISPAD avait énormément de misère à recruter. Par contre, et je finis là-dessus en 1 minute, le portrait n'est pas noir. Il y a eu plusieurs améliorations, notamment suite au rapport de la vérificateur général du Canada et d'autres agents du Parlement. Donc, on a pu voir ces dernières années des échéanciers plus réalistes et des défis qu'on veut atténuer liés au budget. Je trouvais notamment les annonces qui ont été faites pour le brise-glace polaire qui avaient, selon mon humble avis, une plus belle maturité en termes de triple contrainte qu'est-ce qu'on voyait il y a 10-15 ans quand on disait que le brise-glace polaire allait coûter 700 millions de dollars. Donc, on semble plus réaliste au niveau des échéanciers des budgets. Avec les 15 ans de la stratégie, on a pu développer davantage la compétence. Donc, si on regarde la compétence d'il y a 15 ans aujourd'hui, c'est le jour et la nuit. Donc, c'est sûr que la stratégie devient de plus en plus mature. Une belle amélioration au niveau de la gestion des risques, du moins des personnes qu'on a rencontrées qui nous disent qu'effectivement, là, ce n'est pas parfait, mais il y a une belle amélioration. Et des investissements stratégiques dans les chantiers navals. Les chantiers navals deviennent, et là, je ne suis pas un fervent de la privatisation, ce n'est pas ça, mais deviennent, de la publication, excusez-moi, le contraire, mais deviennent presque des partenaires, je veux dire, pour certains chantiers, c'est les uniques contrats qu'on fait. Donc, le gouvernement a dû investir, notamment à CISPAN, mais aussi à la DEVI. Le gouvernement du Québec a investi 500 millions de dollars pour pouvoir que les chantiers soient à jour et puissent livrer en temps opportun les navires. Donc, encore une fois, ça fait partie du multidomaine, non seulement au sein de l'appareil gouvernemental, mais aussi des fournisseurs privés. Donc, j'espère que je n'ai pas trop pris de temps. Ça fait le tour de ma présentation.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Choinière. Personnellement, j'apprends beaucoup en vous parlant. C'est un aspect, un sujet que je connais pas grand-chose, mais je connais l'importance des aspects économiques. Donc, merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Chapeau d'avoir rentré pile poil dans le temps. Nos prochains présentateurs se connaissent. Ils vont faire équipe pour leur présentation. Je vous présente Mme Chelsea Pope et Monsieur Thomas Hughes. Mme Chelsea Pope est doctorante en sciences politiques à l'Université de Carleton. Ses recherches portent sur la destruction des infrastructures dans les missions des ciblages des précisions. Elle a étudié l'engagement stratégique du Canada en Jordanie, Irak et Syrie et a contribué à plusieurs projets de recherche, notamment sur l'invasion russe et les pertes civiles en Ukraine. Son expertise s'étend aux opérations multidomaines, acquises en tant que recherchiste au Center for International and Defense Policy. Maintenant, pour M. Thomas Hughes, il est professeur adjoint à l'Université Mount Allison. Il est aussi directeur adjoint du Center for Defense and Security Studies à l'Université du Manitoba. Il est spécialiste de la défense nord-américaine et arctique, de l'OTAN, et il a coédité le North American Strategic Defense in the 21st Century sur la défense de l'Arctique. Il est coordonnateur du North America and Arctic Defense and Security Network. Il siège au conseil d'administration de la Canadian Naval Review et il a publié son doctorat en 2021 avec un nom-titre que j'adore, The Art of War Games.
Honestly, that's why I wrote it.
Chelsea, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Merci, c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous. Je suis désolé, mon français c'est pas bon, je vais présenter en anglais. So, as we heard in the introduction, Chelsea and I were fortunate enough to work on a project which looked at pan-domain operations primarily in a comparative sense, looking at how Canada had conceptualized pan-domain operations and how that fitted in with the multi-domain operation concept in the US and the similar ideas that were emerging across Canada's partners. Since that project, I've spent a little bit more time thinking about pan-domain operations in the civ-mil context. So our joint presentation from our lofty perch in our academic ivory tower is going to start with my discussion really about that civil-military relationship, and Chelsea will then talk a little bit more about the differences and similarities between Canada's pan-domain approach and some other countries. We'll build on quite a lot of the points that we've started to hear already, and hopefully it gives us some additional useful depth for conversations later on. I want to start with a phenomenal panel presentation from 2018 run by US Army TRADOC. It is available on YouTube for free. Apparently it's not appropriate to put on the list of things to watch on a romantic Friday night dinner with one's wife, but she's strange. Anyway, the reason, excuse me, it is a good panel, full stop, but the reason why I bring it up here, and it's particularly interesting, is because it shows a fascinating disconnect. The two first presentations from General Townsend and General Brown of the United States talk a little bit about the competition space rather than the conflict space, but very quickly they turn to the classic images that we see in all of the discussion about multi-domain operations, the idea of fusing the military domains in order to defeat a near-peer or peer adversary in conventional conflict. Then Lieutenant General Sanders from the UK stands up, and he opens his presentation discussing the way in which the UK is using multi-domain operations as a concept to try and respond to events like the poisoning of the Skripals, which you might remember, dissidents from the US who were living in Salisbury at the time. And why this is particularly interesting, I think, is because it takes us into an understanding of the modern threat environment. But we need to ensure that there is commonality and understanding of what that threat environment actually is and what our key priorities within it are. So, three questions particularly. Firstly, what makes pan-domain different? Secondly, what does this mean for civil-military relations? Because I think it's quite significant. And thirdly, what further considerations do we need to take in order to maximize its effectiveness? I admit that it is a little bit odd to show a picture of a 19th century French ship of the line on a slide which is titled The Modern Threat Environment, but bear with me, I will try and explain it. Quite simply, we have come to understand that the threat environment that we are in now is incredibly uncertain. You might recognize the images from the film Master and Commander. And essentially, at this point, there is a French ship that looms out of the fog to attack the British vessel. And I do think it's quite a good analogy for today. We know that there is a threat out there. We know that there is roughly what sort of shape that threat is. We don't know exactly what damage it can do. We don't know exactly what we can do in return. And we don't know exactly when, where, and how that threat is going to be manifested against us. And this has been talked about an awful lot, from an awful lot of different places, this idea that we are in a changing and uncertain political environment. And often we hear about this now, we're returning to the concept of the conflict-competition continuum and the idea of grey zone operations. And I think we have to be careful with this for two reasons. The first is that the competition-conflict continuum, or the competition continuum, suggests that there is a linearity, so that we move further towards or further away from conflict. And I don't think that's entirely true anymore. We're in such an uncertain environment that that clarity of escalation ladder just isn't there. The key point for us today is being able to live comfortably in that grey zone. And that comes to the second problem. And it's quite simply that the grey zone covers a huge variety of operations, of actions, of defense challenges. And to put them all within this idea of the grey zone, I think is a little bit problematic. And this brings us into the idea, really, that is fundamental to our discussion, that it requires the Canadian Armed Forces to contribute across those adversary actions, across that whole spectrum, such as it is. So, we'll go back to school for a few moments and look at civil-military relations. There's been an enormous amount of ink spilled about the right way to structure civil-military relations. We don't need to go into all of that here, but one of the sort of most prominent in recent years has been Schiff's concordance theory, the idea that particularly within political-military decision-making, you have a balance between political decision-makers, the armed forces, and society. And when that is in balance, everything's okay. The problem with this came quite quickly when Schiff and others were looking at the war on terror and the way in which the military interacted with the political decision makers at that point. So Schiff modified that argument slightly and came up with this idea of targeted partnership. And this gets us a little bit closer to pan-domain operations. It's the idea that at certain points, there is a new configuration of civilian and military decision making. However, again, this doesn't quite fit the pan-domain concept. The problem here is that targeted partnership is about a specific objective and a very temporally limited period of time. As I said, we need to live comfortably within that grey zone. That means that objective is not necessarily completely clear, nor is the end state completely clear. I don't like using my own quotes, but I was quite proud of this one, so I decided to include it. But I think it's hopefully quite a useful one for us to think about the way in which the armed forces contributes to pan-domain operations and how it can understand that relationship with civilian authorities. Essentially, we need to think about pan-domain operations as shaping the environment that enables those military components to be successful. And that's where the civilian components comes in here. Now, to be clear, my understanding, at least, the pan-domain approach is not that this is just whole of government on steroids, but we are thinking about this idea about a whole of government coordination, as the PDF document talks about. Again, we've heard lots of different ways of thinking about the levers of national power, perhaps the two most prominent in recent years, the dime or the midfield components. And really, Pan-domain is about fusing those levers. We don't necessarily need to do everything all at once, but it's about understanding that complementarity. So, how is it that we can use these different levers in conjunction to achieve the effect that we're wanting to? And this, I think, leads us to two of the great challenges that we have. I have to be very careful with this next statement because Dr. Kimball and her team have put on a fantastic event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions today. But if we think about those midfield levers and understand the military as part of this broader idea of addressing today's threats, where is anybody in this audience from any of the departments outside the M of midfield? This isn't unique. Every event that I have ever been to in which pan-domain or multi-domain operations have been discussed have had sometimes industry representation, but outside that, silence. And this, again, isn't the fault of the organizers here. I think if we walked into the Bank of Canada, Transport Canada, any of those other departments that we might think of, a border agency who conceivably could have a role to play in pan-domain operations, there would be nobody in there who would have a clue what you're talking about. That might be slightly different with the Coast Guard, but even there I would suggest that the depth of thinking about pan-domain has not been the same as it is within the armed forces. And quite simply, if we are going to optimize the pan-domain concept, those voices have to be here as well. That creates some challenges, as you are very much aware. A lot of differences in culture between those organizations, a lot of differences in working practices. But let us assume that that is successful. We will assume that that fusion has occurred. We are successfully bringing together all of those levers of national power. There is another challenge here, I think, and it's decision-making authority and those lines of authority. Quite simply, who is able to authorize and require the deployment of different capabilities from different government departments? From a Canadian Navy perspective, if the DND has decided that the best way to deal with a threat is to engage other government departments, can they just go to the Coast Guard and say, come on, give us your people, we need you? And perhaps more troublingly for the population of this room, what happens if it's the other way around? That has huge implications for maritime policing, particularly, especially in the Canadian context. And alongside that, who is responsible for identifying the pressure points of an adversary once we understand their threat? Because our approach to pan-domain operations is being oblique. It's about going in a different direction and being able to pressure that adversary such that they change their behavior, perhaps not as a direct response to their action. Who defines that pressure point? And who makes the decision when to push the button? And we often think about pan-domain operations as like a spider's web, with everything connected. But that means that there's a spider in the middle, and that is the wrong way to think about this. We have to have decentralized decision-making. You cannot have that spider in the middle. It doesn't work. Nobody can have that degree of knowledge of what's happening. So within that, pan-domain operations necessitates a clear and common understanding of who makes decisions and when. With that, I'll pass you to Chelsea.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today, and thank you, Thomas, for the introduction to what we'll be discussing further. I want to start by acknowledging that Nils started his presentation with acknowledging that PDO and MDO concepts are different, yet we use them interchangeably. Now, why is that? So PDO and MDO concepts, they essentially characterize a shift in the way that the military levers its commission. And at the center of this shift would obviously be integrated, innovative structures in the way in which we execute all of our domains. But there is a distinction, however, that needs to be made. And so my point here at the beginning of my presentation will be to go over the differences in PDO, MDO, and then I'll further integrate into alliance structures and how we can align ourselves. And I'll also reference 2 case studies where the DND and the CAF more specifically has built some foundations for PDO operations and what lessons we can learn. So beginning with PDO, Thomas has emphasized the need for civilian military approaches. So this would necessitate us breaking down the silos that we typically see between the military, government agencies, and private industries to create an all-of-government or whole-of-government approach. This means that the military operations are aligned with both domestic policies, foreign diplomacy, but also development sharing initiatives. Also, when we look at PDO operations in the Canadian context, we're looking at 6 different domains. So we're looking at land, sea, air, space, cyber, but also information. Now, when we draw upon MDO, they acknowledge the typical 5 domains, but they don't necessitate that of information. They see that information is important, but in order to promote the other domains. MDO is typically used by the United States, and it has been used in order to counter adversarial threats, mostly that of Russia and China. So we can see that it's highly effective for combat, but it's less focused on aspects of hybrid warfare and civilian agency cooperation. So it makes itself distinct from pan-domain. Oh, sorry, I forgot to switch my slide. Okay, so here we put together a comparative case among some of Canada and its allies. So of its allies, we have Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Norway, and Australia. And these cases were selected mostly because they are aligned in most of its security strategies. We can see most of them as members within the Five Eyes, NATO, but also Indo-Pacific security strategies. And most importantly, they've all acknowledged the rise of great power competition. So we're looking towards Russia and China specifically for this, but Japan also, as I'll elaborate later, expands on North Korea. One of the key distinctions that can be made, you might see on screen here, is the difference in what constitutes a domain. So we see UK and Japan looking at the electromagnetic spectrum, whereas Canada and Australia, are more centered on informational domains. But the reason that I'm showing you this comparative case is because collaboration with partners and stakeholders is the utmost importance for the success of pan-domain operations. So we can greatly enhance our capabilities and capacities when we learn to work together. So I'll go through a little bit more in detail about what constitutes their domains and areas of specialty here. But I think the crux of my argument is going to be that there's no center definition for what constitutes a domain. And that can create challenges down the road in how we choose to align ourselves with our allies and show a bleak threat. So Canada understands pan-domain operations through a middle ground, actually, between the United States and the UK. And it focuses on integrating its military capabilities with civilian organizations. But it also integrates the need of cultural change between these organizations that we associate ourselves with. The US approach is less concerned with the networking between non-military organizations. And Japan's PDO/MDO concept, they mostly focus on multi-domain operations, mostly centers around countering emerging threats from China, Russia, and North Korea. But there's a specific emphasis here on the use of cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum, which is further advanced by other countries, including France, but they both highlight the need for interoperability among both their approaches. France sees the potential in forming new alliances within Europe to align its capabilities. And on the contrast, we have Norway, who adopts a total defensive concept, which focuses on civil defense, societal resilience, and cooperation between the military and its civil society. Well, Canada and its allies, they all emphasize the importance for partnerships and collaboration. The extent to which they expect their allies to engage may be differ, especially when we're looking at the United States and Canadian context, which can also create some difficulties later on down the road in emphasizing the full effect of pan-domain operations. Also, some other aspects would be the gray zone short of war, and the agreed lines of authority, but also further discussed today, a communal managing language for understanding multiple operations. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to some case studies where we've seen the foundations for pan-domain operations and some lessons that we can learn from them. So firstly, we have the provincial reconstruction teams in Kandahar, Afghanistan. So this began under Operation Athena, which started in 2003 and spanned about 2 years. The first phase of Operation Athena was mostly used for democracy promotion, and it was executed in Kabul, the capital city. But it's the second phase of Operation Athena that I want to pay particular attention to. It was based out of the southern province of Kandahar, and it was more expansive, ranging about 6 years. The phase had 3 concurrent elements, so we're looking at security, governance, and economic development. After the 3 RCR brought stability to the region, the provincial reconstruction teams were able to get working, but they did not work independently. They worked with multiple segments of the Canadian government in what was termed a whole-of-government approach. So this meant the civilian presence of the Correctional Services Canada, the RCMP, the Canadian International Development Agency, and the Department of Foreign Affairs, in addition to international trade, grew threefold, and most of its concentration was met in Kandahar. This concept aligns with pan-domain operations because we're emphasizing leveraging all national actors of power, which includes military, economic, diplomatic, and informational, to counter adversarial actions. So a key issue that the provincial reconstruction teams faced was the broader implementation of PDO, as we're looking at it today, is the challenge of lines of authority and command structures. So their efforts were often hindered by unclear national objectives and difficulties integrating different organizations that had their distinct cultures and frameworks. One of the primary concerns as well was the inability to enhance interoperability and failed to see a unified response across all domains. So the provincial reconstruction teams here can show us 3 things. 1, the need for clear objectives. 2, flexible and agile structures. And 3, the need to leverage civilian and military cooperation. Moving on to the second example, the Marine Security Operations Centers, or we can term it MSOCs, which essentially emerged in 2004 after the National Security Strategy. They're essentially hubs that amass, analyze, and disseminate information regarding all maritime activity off the nation's coast. They have 3 different locations, so we're looking at Halifax, Victoria, and Niagara. And the centers were developed on the premise for bringing together government departments that include and were important for asset support, marine security, and maritime expertise. These departments included the DND, the RCMP, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canada Coast Guard, Canada Border Services Agency, and Transport Canada. So by sharing information and collaborating where possible and making a less duplication effort, they were able to leverage multiple domains and that civil-military connection. Now, the operationalization of the process is a step towards integrating PDO capabilities, but the response to the identified threats that they perceived are often limited to the mandates to which they're limited by and involved into with their organization. And the practical application of PDO would necessitate that engaging with the civilian military agencies would require a more flexible arrangement of capabilities that include both situational awareness and actions against a perceived threat. So this also raises concerns surrounding making authority where either the military is tasked to directly support these civilian organizations or vice versa. Okay, and we can also highlight through these case studies especially, while the operationalization of them weren't fully cognizant with the PDO approach, they nonetheless present an oblique threat. So we can see this through the multiple domains that shape adversary behavior, the information domain, which shapes narratives that influence public policy and perception in decision making, and lastly, the aligning its structures and concepts across allied nations. It sends a clear message signaling collective resolve among Canada and its allies. So to summarize our last pieces here, are we on time or are we going over? We're good, okay. Okay, great, so we're right on time. The PDO concept represents an intriguing approach to addressing radically new threats that are emerging within our globalized world. As written, PDO requires a new conceptualization of civilian and military operations. PDO as a concept is widespread but not unified across Canada and its allies. And D&D and CAF have experience and foundations of PDO, as we can see in the provincial reconstruction teams and MSOCs. The next phase then is permanent engagement and joint action. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas and Chelsea. Thank you for making the remark, Chelsea, that pan-domain is not the same thing as multi-domain operations. And Thomas, I love that spider web analogy. I think I'm going to keep using it. Alors, on est maintenant rendu à la période des questions. Si jamais il y a des questions dans la salle ou en ligne.
Bonjour, la question est pour monsieur ici. My name is Nathalie Lotan. I'm working for the Naval Reserve headquarters here in Quebec. In your studies, could you share with us whether mandatory military service is a factor in commitment or in reducing civil and military barriers? The mandatory service.
Sorry, could you repeat the first half of that question?
Okay. In your studies, could you tell us if the mandatory service for military, is it a factor of commitment to reduce barriers between civilian and militaries?
Fantastic question. Sorry, thank you. It was the mandatory part I didn't quite catch. I think it does help in the socialization. There's a greater understanding of what the military is for and what it does. I think what we see, just from a personal perspective and talking to my friends and other folks who don't have experience of working with the military, as you're probably aware, there are a lot of misconceptions about what the military is, how it works, and having that mandatory service does help with that. And it potentially creates those connections between civilian, what people who've moved back to civilian life and those who've remained in the armed forces. So you do have that ability to pick up a telephone and potentially talk to people you know. That's a big thumbs up there. The challenge then is the institutional connection. So the social connection is there. There's an appreciation perhaps of the military in a way there isn't maybe in Canada, but that doesn't automatically link to civilian agencies able to work with the armed forces effectively. Often there is alignment on those two things. We look at Finland, for example, is a really interesting example of that, but it's not, I think the same amount of work has to be put into the formal and institutional connections and build on that social approach. We couldn't assume that just having mandatory service is going to result in easy collaboration. Does that answer that?
Bonjour, bon matin, lieutenant-colonel Labonté. Je suis le commandant du 2e bataillon au 22e régiment et je suis le dernier commandant du groupement tactique en Lettonie. I'll have my question in English, and my question is for the last two presenters and Mr. Nils. Understand that PFAC for me looks like a national security policy that we need. But for the military, the Canadian military, either for the Army, Navy, and Air Force domain, I think we need MDO. We need MDO because we need to understand MDO, and it's not in PFAC. And we need to understand MDO because if we need to fight against Russia and China, it's going to be within the MDO concept that the U.S. Army has lead, and we're not there at all, not at all. And when I work 2 years ago with 1st Canadian Division, with 3 UK Div in England. They had a concept in their mind that 3 UK Div, as the sole division able to deploy, will have all national security assets under them. And they've created a multi-domain operation synchronization board within their cycle of planification in order to fight with the cyber and other domain asset. And as the Canadian Army and Canadian Armed Force, we're not there. So I was wondering, what's your thought on the future of MDO in Canada? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start off. So the future of MDO Canada, NATO recently released a new document outlining the MDO principle. So it does follow, it actually takes a middle ground between the Canadian and the United States approach, in that it emphasizes the great power competition that we're seeing and the need for high levels of essentially hard power to go against what we're seeing. But also it emphasizes that civil military approach, which I think is absolutely essential to pan-domain operations. So if we're looking at the future of Canada's multi-domain, pan-domain operations, perhaps aligning itself with its allies in NATO would create a more unified response. It's just an idea.
If I may,
Yeah.
if I may, I have another comment about your example of the KPRT. As probably a lot of members here in the Army has been, I personally deploy within the KPRT. I think we need to be very careful by not mixing PFEC and JIMP operation, Joint Interagency Operation, which when we were in KPRT, it was a heavy land domain operation with the support of other agency. And it's something that, if not, it's everything is PFEC now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that also brings into account the aspects of line of authority too, which we're discussing today. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Dernière question.
I do have, could I say a few words to that one?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, this idea of PFEC being to a degree part of or an impetus for the national security policy that we need, or the national military strategy that we need, that was absolutely not lost on the writing team. There were some things done as part of the broader How We Fight initiative to try and bring out such a strategy or such a policy through other means, one of them being the Joint Operations Symposium. I do think we need the ability to be interoperable with allies that are conducting multi-domain operations. And when I think about multi-domain operations, I'm thinking it as a concept that is there primarily to penetrate anti-access and area denial systems and then exploit the freedom of maneuver that comes from that. I mean, we need that too. We need both. I would say that we need the overarching kind of change in direction, the swing to major power competition and all that comes with it that the PFEC gives us. I think that we need defense of the Canadian homeland first, but I also think that we need to be able to integrate in with forces that are doing MDO. And I will say that it is coming. It is going that way. After I'm done this call, I'm going to be immediately switching over to a call that's discussing joint targeting, which gets at exactly the kind of thing that you were discussing in the question. It's coming.
Merci, Nils.
I will attempt to be brief. I completely agree with you. But we need to, in my opinion, understand that there is a need to address both types of threat. And I think PFEC tried to do that, and quite rightly, PFEC ultimately focuses on the armed forces, and I'm certainly not saying that RCMP are going to be having a battlefield role in a great power conflict. That's not obviously not what's going to happen. So yes, we absolutely need that. To operate in the gray zone, though, successfully, I think we also need to think about that government, other engagement with other government departments. And just to take an example from the presentation which came at the start, this concept we need to defend the maritime approaches to Canada. Sure. From what? Now, are we defending against a powerful Russian or Chinese fleet steaming across the Atlantic or Pacific? Or do we need to defend Canada's approaches from illegal fishing? The answer to that, I think, is both. The military will have a different role in both of those things. It asks different things of the military, but the military may have a role in both of those concepts. It is not just potentially a policing role. So when we think about anti-access area denial and the maneuver space, I think it's quite helpful to try and expand that, explode that. Our adversaries have an anti-access system that is their entire security architecture. It's not just missiles against aircraft or ships or the like. How can we get inside that maneuver space that might be their economy, that once we've punctured that bubble, then we can really maneuver in there and hit a pressure point to stop them doing something in the South China Sea, for example. We don't like island building. How do we signal that? Well, let's go in a different direction. And that requires the military to work alongside other agencies, I think. So yes, I completely agree with you. Focus within the military. Point one, can we do MDO? It has to go alongside, I think, that second component to make the things like the PRT work if we're called on it to do it again. Does that answer that?
Merci, merci beaucoup. On va prendre une dernière question, puis on va vous donner un peu plus de pause, faites-vous-en pas. Mais on a eu une très intéressante discussion. On va prendre encore une question. Allez-y.
So, hello. My question was for, especially for Mrs. Pope, for that part of the presentation. So you talked about Canada being or understanding the pan-domain as kind of a middle ground between the States and the UK. You also mentioned the Five Eyes. How can we envision future cooperation, or how would that look like in a context where our closest or historically closest ally is kind of turning their backs on us right now?
Yeah, I think that, thank you for the question. That's a great question. So when we actually released our report, we did interviews with a few United States Army members. And one of the things that they highlighted was a need for a global sharing system among Canada and its allies to streamline information. But of course, when we're talking about different domains, we're looking at cybersecurity, which we know Russia plays a key role in breaking down those barriers. I think that, I don't think it's unprecedented, though, that we're seeing a relationship between the United States and Canada that's fluctuating. When we have presidential elections that take place every 4 years, and we have federal elections in Canada, there's a lot of different personalities that are involved. And so when we're looking at the military approach to it, isn't directly coming from, aspects of presidents and senates and congresses. We're looking at different domains in military to streamline information, right? So I think that we have to look at it less like a top-down approach and a more integrated approach among communications among different sectors. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Une tribune extrêmement intéressante. Je pense qu'on aurait pu encore en parler beaucoup plus longtemps, mais ça va contribuer évidemment, comme je disais tout à l'heure, Nicolas, merci pour votre leadership là, dans l'organisation de cette tribune-là. Et l'idée, c'était un peu de mettre la table pour ce qui suit cet après-midi ou cet avant-midi là, après la pause. Alors donc, vous avez fait un excellent travail. Merci beaucoup, Nils, en ligne aussi. Vous avez été très, très clair. Alors, si vous voulez vous joindre à moi pour remercier la première tribune pour leur excellent travail. On va aller en pause et on va revenir à 10h50. Je fais juste un rappel que cette pause-là nous est offerte par un commanditaire, la compagnie Basecamp Connect qui est représentée ici. Merci beaucoup pour votre appui, c'est très important. Un fidèle collaborateur depuis quelques années. Alors donc, on va boire notre café à votre santé. Merci beaucoup.